Did Howard Phillips Lovecraft keep a death diary? Does it still exist? And if so, what can we learn about Lovecraft's last days from it? Samarius Fane here, and today we're going to talk about the contents of Lovecraft's so-called death diary. In Lovecraft's obituary, it's stated that he wrote clinical notes as a help for his physician. In these notes, Lovecraft cataloged his declining health up until a few days prior to his death. Lovecraft began this diary on January 1st, 1937, just 2 months before his death on March 15th of the same year. The diary itself is long gone at this point, but its contents have been saved from the jaws of death by his neighbor R. Elaine Everts, who published them in a rare 1987 book entitled The Death of a Gentleman, The Last Days of Howard Phillips Lovecraft. It's an incredibly short book at 28 pages and allegedly contains the diary for 1937 in full, as well as Lovecraft's obituaries and an advertisement for the movie Winterset, which he saw on January 2nd. The book is rarely up for sale and incredibly expensive for what little it actually contains. I myself don't own a copy because in 1987 I was busy stuffing quarters into Double Dragon instead of purchasing obscure books. For that reason, a somewhat abridged form of the diary is all I have to work with. In this condensed form, the first few entries and some of the later entries appear in full. The rest of the entries are condensed and focus around Lovecraft's failing health. The condensed entries show his commentary on his deteriorating health. The later complete entries are nearly as short as his condensed entries, so I doubt we're really missing much. Still, I'd love to see the full entries. Is this diary really a set of clinical notes, a sort of death diary as the obituary claims? Well, yes and no. It doesn't appear to have been begun as a set of clinical notes. The first entry makes no mention of Lovecraft's health. In fact, he wasn't even seeing a doctor at this point. However, as time passes, the entries become more and more focused on Lovecraft's suffering. He was most certainly showing them to Dr. Cecil Calvert Dustin from February 16th on. By then, he'd already been told he was terminal. These handwritten notes are very short, especially when compared to the lengthy letters he would write and type out night after night to friends, fans, and associates. Let's take a peek into these notes. The notes begin with Lovecraft detailing a laid-back day in Providence, Rhode Island. Lovecraft took a leisurely walk in between writing, and being a New England history buff, he read a book on the history of Rhode Island. After enjoying a pleasantly warm New Year's Day, Lovecraft lighted the Christmas tree for the sake of spectacle and ritual, since Lovecraft actually didn't believe in the miracle of Christmas. He wrote some more letters by the light of the tree, and then went to bed a little after midnight. It seemed an auspicious start to the new year. January 2nd was a little less pleasant. It began to rain, but Lovecraft braves the poor weather to go and see what was likely his last movie. I actually enjoyed the movie Winterset. It's pretty good if you have the ability to watch slow-paced black and white movies without falling asleep. I'll put a link to it below for anyone interested. The rest of January 2nd was typical for Lovecraft. He spent most of it writing letters and went to bed at 12:30, just as he'd done the night before. However, he was woken up by what he called digestive trouble in the middle of the night. This was certainly a manifestation of the cancer that would take his life within months. He had trouble sleeping and got up at 4 in the morning. He took his mind off the disease he was feeling by writing more letters. He was up until 8 a.m. when he fell back asleep. There isn't another entry until 4 days later. In this entry, he notes that he feels considerable grippe. Grippe is an archaic word for the influenza. and Lovecraft habitually used this word to describe the stomach trouble he felt throughout his life. From here on out, the entries revolve almost entirely around his growing discomfort and become very short and pointed. His next entry on January 10th shows the continuation of the pain in his gut. Lovecraft also mentions the swelling of his feet, which began at least a day or two prior. This condition is known as edema, and it's caused by the kidney trouble that worked in concert with Lovecraft's cancer to eventually end his life. On the 14th of January, he notes that his foot is fully swollen and his gut pain has continued. At this point, Lovecraft puts his pen down and doesn't pick it up again until the 23rd. At that point, he writes that his digestive trouble has gone on for at least the past 7 days. One day later, the pain is even worse. On the upside, he felt a little bit less swollen for the moment. 2 days later, he notes that he has trouble sleeping. By this point, Lovecraft wasn't able to sleep lying down, and took to sleeping in a chair with pillows stuffed about it to make it more comfortable. The next day, he has more of what he calls digestive trouble, and he notes that his overall health is poor. Still bound to his work and obligations, he begins to revise a story for Duane Ramel, a correspondent and fellow fiction writer. Although he takes frequent breaks from it, he manages to finish the revision the following day. February brings more of the same, with days of digestive difficulty followed by restless nights. By the 13th, he mentions complications, along with his digestive trouble, but he doesn't specify exactly what these complications are. As Lovecraft was a person inclined to downplay such matters, it can be assumed that these complications were highly unpleasant. 2 days later, he switches from talking about digestive pain to the more specific intestinal trouble. On February 16th, a doctor is finally called in. Dr. Cecil Calvert Dustin arrives for an examination and prescribes some pain medication for the ailing Lovecraft. It's entirely possible that Lovecraft hadn't been taking anything for his pain up until this point. The following day, Lovecraft describes his continuing pain as acute. February 20th is a particularly bad day. He describes the gassy bloating troubling his gut. The ailing author, however, still manages to get some reading in somehow. On the 21st of February, Lovecraft, in the agony of his disease, still tries to perform his accustomed activities, reading and writing between his bouts of pain. The following day keeps Lovecraft entirely from his activities, however, as his pain crescendos. Lovecraft calls the night of February 22nd his worst night yet. The next 2 days bring pain and more pain. On the 27th of February, Lovecraft's aunt, Annie Gamwell, telephones Dr. Dustin to tell him that Lovecraft's condition has drastically worsened. He was vomiting regularly and couldn't keep any food down. He was in as much pain standing as sitting down, and he had immense difficulty sleeping. March begins with Annie phoning Dr. Dustin to recommend an internal medicine specialist, Dr. Leet. By this point, however, Lovecraft was horribly swollen with fluid and gas. He could do little but take in a few moments of precious sleep here and there. On March 2nd, he wrote at various points during the day, very punctuated, small entries, showing just how horrible he felt. He wrote, pain, drowse, intense pain, rest, great pain. It's truly sad that the pain had become so intense that Lovecraft, who would normally describe the simplest things with a torrent of choice words, could only find the strength to write pain over and over again. The 3rd of March brings pain, pain, and pain. His friend Harry Brobst came to visit and saw the pitiful state of his friend. Brobst was a psychiatric nurse at Butler Hospital, where Lovecraft's mother and father spent their last years. Brobst's medical training no doubt clued him into Lovecraft's terrible state, even though the writer tried to downplay his condition. Brobst also downplayed the seriousness of Lovecraft's condition when writing to mutual friends around this time. The 4th of March is highlighted by a pain worse than Lovecraft had ever felt before, that continued to worsen as the day went on. His friend Brobst visits Lovecraft once again. Lovecraft begins taking warm baths, which seem to alleviate his pain somewhat. The next day is marked by intensifying pain, and on the following day, Lovecraft's aunt calls Dr. Leet, the internal medicine specialist recommended by Dr. Dustin a week before. Leet arrives to find Lovecraft naked, swollen with edema, and pitifully crammed into a bathtub. Leet is unable to alleviate Lovecraft's suffering, and the horror writer suffers what he describes as hideous pain that day, followed by an awful night. Still, he somehow manages to get some reading in. March 7th marks a continuation of the hideous pain, while March 8th leaves Lovecraft barely able to move, but hurting a little bit less. On March 9th, Annie Gamwell once again calls Dr. Leet, who is unable to remedy Lovecraft's pain. Lovecraft by this time was malnourished since he couldn't keep anything down that he tried to eat. On March 10th, Harry Brobst visits again. Brobst, fearful of how weak Lovecraft was getting, calls in Dr. Leet. Dr. Leet arrives, but seeing that there's little he could do, he recommends that Lovecraft go to the hospital for comfort care in his last days. Lovecraft then checks into Jane Brown Memorial Hospital, and after a considerable wait, is taken to his room. Lovecraft tries to eat in the hospital, but he just keeps vomiting it back up. March 11th, Lovecraft's blood is taken, and he begins receiving intravenous nourishment. Lovecraft, however, continues to vomit. He apparently receives some form of electropathy at this point. This would be an electric shock administered by an electrified pad applied to his body. This really couldn't have helped matters any. It's at this point that Lovecraft is unable to hold a pen any longer, and his diary ends. On the 12th, Lovecraft's aunt, Annie Gamwell, writes Lovecraft's friend and colleague, Robert Hayward Barlow, the following letter. I have intended to write you a gay little letter long since, but now I'm writing a sad little letter telling you that Howard is so pitifully ill and weak. The dear fellow grows weaker and weaker. Nothing can be retained in his stomach. Needless to say, he's been pathetically patient and philosophical through it all. On the 13th, we know that Harry Brobst came in with his wife to visit Lovecraft one final time. He asked Lovecraft how he felt. Lovecraft struggled for words in his pitiful state and told him, "Sometimes the pain is unbearable." Brobst, knowing Lovecraft couldn't be comforted by an appeal to religion or the afterlife, told his friend to think back on the ancient Greek philosophers who were so stoic in the face of death. Lovecraft couldn't manage to respond to Brobst with words, but merely smiled at his friend's suggestion. On March 14th, the edema was so bad that nearly 7 quarts of liquid had to be drained from Lovecraft's stomach. His friend Robert Barlow had received Annie's letter about Lovecraft's condition. Realizing he had little time, he telegraphed a response to Annie instead of writing a letter that would take days to receive. In his telegraph, Barlow offered to rush from Kansas to Providence and help as best as he could. At 7:15, however, the following day, Lovecraft died. Annie sadly wrote Barlow, "Howard died this morning. Nothing to do. Thanks." Annie herself would die in poverty 4 years later of the breast cancer she'd been fighting for years. This was a rather sad and difficult video to make due to its subject matter. I feel the story of Lovecraft's last days is important in humanizing the man. I remember the shock I felt when I first read about the details of his death. Having read his stories and letters, I don't know, I guess I felt like I knew Lovecraft to some degree and related to portions of his life. He never really seemed gone to me, I guess, just someone I might visit if it weren't for the gulf of space and time. Lovecraft's final journal, however, gave an unsettling sense of finality to the man. Thanks for watching.